Colonel Marcus James was a decorated officer in the U.S. Army, a man of discipline and power, admired by all who served under him. Private Lila Green was a young soldier with big dreams and a fragile resolve, seeking direction in the unforgiving world of military life. When their paths crossed, it was supposed to be a mentorship, a professional relationship built on trust and respect. But behind closed doors, a dangerous secretive affair began to take root. As the lines between power, obsession, and love blurred, it would all end in a shocking act of violence that no one saw coming. Colonel Marcus James was a man of distinction, a name that commanded respect in the U.S. Army. His reputation was untouchable. A decorated officer with multiple commendations for bravery, intelligence, and leadership, James had risen through the ranks with ease. He was known for his strategic mind and his ability to inspire loyalty in the troops under his command. Those who served with him admired his unwavering dedication and poise, qualities that made him a pillar in the military community. He exuded confidence and authority, someone who could handle any crisis with calm precision. His presence alone was enough to instill a sense of discipline in those around him. His soldiers trusted him implicitly, knowing that under his leadership they would always be guided through challenges with clear direction and purpose. But behind the accolades, there was something darker. A quiet, hidden side of James that few knew about. An emptiness, a loneliness that lingered in the spaces between his carefully constructed image. Despite his professional success, he struggled to form meaningful personal connections. Those closest to him were often left wondering if he truly let anyone in, or if his stern exterior was just a mask to keep others at a distance. The colonel's relationships were strictly professional, and even though he had risen to the highest ranks of the military, there was an unspoken sense that he was more isolated than he cared to admit. For years, James kept his personal life a mystery. There were whispers, of course. Rumors that he had briefly been married and that the union ended in divorce, though details were scarce. But whatever pain he might have felt, James pushed it aside, burying it deep beneath his dedication to the Army. His career was everything, and he let nothing distract him from his pursuit of excellence. He had learned early in life that power and control were the only things that mattered in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. In the Army, he found structure, a place where he could channel his energy and rise above the emotional turbulence that had defined much of his personal life. Despite his success, there was an unsettling edge to James, a quiet discontent that no one could quite place. To some, it was a mark of his brilliance, an intensity that fueled his ambition. But to others, it seemed like a warning. Those who were perceptive enough sensed that beneath his hard exterior lay a man who might be too invested in the power he held, a man whose need for control could eventually lead him down a dangerous path. What others didn't know was that James's perfectionism, his ironclad discipline, was slowly eating away at him, driving him into isolation and pushing him toward a future he couldn't yet see. Private Lila Green arrived at the U.S. Army base, with hopes and dreams that were as big as the uniform she wore. At 22, she was young, eager, and determined to prove herself in a world dominated by men. Her decision to join the Army had been one of necessity and ambition. Growing up, in a small town, Lila had never felt like she quite belonged. She had always been the quiet one, the girl who observed more than she spoke, someone who struggled to fit into the mold of expectations that society placed on her. She knew that joining the military would be her chance to change that, to create a new identity for herself, one built on strength and purpose. From the moment she arrived, the transition wasn't easy. The rigid structure, the demanding physical training, and the unspoken pressures of military life were overwhelming. Lila quickly realized that being a woman in a male-dominated environment was harder than she had anticipated. Her fellow soldiers treated her with a mix of indifference and curiosity, never fully accepting her as one of their own. The veterans, particularly the men, looked at her like an outsider, as if her presence on the base was an anomaly. The whispers and sideways glances were subtle, but they stung. Lila worked harder than ever to prove herself, always pushing her limits in training, always staying just a step ahead of the judgment she could feel from those around her. She wasn't used to the scrutiny, but she pushed through, determined to rise above it. She threw herself into every task with a dedication that made her stand out, even if it was in ways that few others noticed. Her instructors praised her work ethic, and little by little she began to earn the respect of those around her. Yet, despite her determination, the loneliness never quite left. She felt like an outsider, someone who was always looking in but never fully a part of the group. Then, Colonel Marcus James noticed her. At first, it was nothing more than a professional interest. Her discipline and quiet resilience caught his attention. To James, Lila was a puzzle, one he felt compelled to solve. There was something about her demeanor, her eyes, that reminded him of his younger self. She was driven, but there was an underlying vulnerability that intrigued him. Unlike the other soldiers, she didn't try to fit in. She simply existed in the space around her, silently watching and learning. It was this quality that set her apart from the rest, and James couldn't help but take a personal interest in her development. Lila, initially unaware of the significance of the attention, simply saw it as an opportunity to learn. Colonel James was a figure to be admired, a man who had achieved what she could only dream of. His guidance felt like an endorsement of her efforts, a validation that she was on the right path. It was at first a small comfort, a recognition in a world that had made her feel invisible. The first time Colonel Marcus James approached Private Lila Green, it was in the midst of a grueling training exercise. The soldiers were tasked with navigating an obstacle course that had been designed to push them to their limits, testing both their physical strength and mental endurance. Lila had been struggling with one of the more difficult portions of the course, a wall that required a combination of speed, strength, and precision to scale. As she attempted it for the third time, her arms aching and her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, she caught the attention of Colonel James, who was overseeing the exercise. He stood at a distance, watching her, his gaze intense and calculating. Lila didn't see him at first, consumed by the task at hand. But when she failed again, landing heavily on the ground with a grunt, she looked up and saw him standing there, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her. The other soldiers had already moved on, but James stayed rooted in place, his gaze unrelenting. She quickly scrambled to her feet, embarrassed by the failure, but instead of the reprimand she feared, James simply nodded. "You're pushing yourself hard," he said, his voice steady and measured. "But sometimes it's not about force. It's about timing and technique." His words caught her off guard. They weren't the harsh criticisms she had grown used to hearing from the other officers. They weren't dismissive either. There was something in the way he spoke to her, respect perhaps, or an unspoken understanding. It was the first time someone had acknowledged her struggles in a way that didn't make her feel inadequate. She nodded, grateful for the advice, but also a little nervous under his scrutiny. Over the next few weeks, their interactions became more frequent. Colonel James would occasionally pull her aside after exercises or training drills, offering guidance and feedback. His advice was never condescending, always framed as a suggestion rather than an order, and Lila found herself absorbing everything he said with an intensity she hadn't known she was capable of. She appreciated his approach. It was unlike any other mentor she had encountered. His words weren't just about improving her technique. They were about improving her mindset, about how to think strategically, how to approach challenges with a calm, clear head. But as their interactions grew more frequent, Lila began to notice something more subtle beneath the surface. There was a warmth in James's attention, a personal interest that seemed to go beyond professional concern. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination. After all, he was just being kind, wasn't he? Many officers took time to mentor their subordinates. It was part of the job. But there was something different about the way he looked at her. Something that made her feel like she was more than just another soldier to him. At the same time, Lila couldn't help but feel flattered by the attention. For the first time since joining the army, someone was noticing her in a way that felt significant. She had always been an outsider, always just a face in the crowd. But Colonel James saw something in her, something that made her feel seen and valued in a way no one else had. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being important to someone who held so much power and influence. What began as mentorship quickly started to take on a different tone. The more time they spent together, the more their conversations lingered, their exchanges becoming increasingly personal. They spoke about their pasts, their dreams, their ambitions. Lila learned about James's military career, the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. He spoke about the loneliness that often came with his rank, the weight of responsibility that kept him at arm's length from everyone else. In turn, Lila confided in him about her struggles with fitting in, the way she had always felt like she was on the outside looking in, even among her fellow soldiers. It was during one of these conversations, late one evening after a particularly tough training session, that their connection shifted. There was a moment, a quiet pause between their words, where the atmosphere felt charged with something unspoken. The warmth between them was palpable, and Lila felt her heart race, unsure of what she was feeling. She had never felt this kind of pull before, not toward anyone. But something about the way he looked at her in that moment made her feel both exhilarated and terrified at once. And yet, despite the growing tension, Lila couldn't help but continue to seek out his company, to crave the way he made her feel like she mattered. It was as though his presence filled a void inside her, a need for connection she hadn't even realized she had. She tried to ignore the subtle signs that this might be crossing a line, telling herself it was just the closeness of a mentor and his mentee. But deep down, she knew things were beginning to change. Slowly, imperceptibly, but undeniably. As weeks passed, the lines between mentorship and something more began to blur, and neither Colonel James nor Private Lila Green could deny the growing tension between them. What had begun as a professional relationship based on respect and mutual goals began to take on a deeper, more intimate nature. The moments they shared, once confined to casual conversations about training or military strategy, now lingered, with a charge that neither could fully ignore. What had once been a helpful hand guiding her through difficult tasks slowly became something much more personal. At first, Lila tried to convince herself that the attraction she felt toward the colonel was nothing more than admiration. After all, he was everything she aspired to be: successful, confident, and in control. He had achieved what she could only dream of, and his attention felt like an acknowledgement of her potential. But the more they spoke, the more she began to notice the subtle changes in his behavior. His praise, once casual, became more frequent, and his gestures, once formal, grew more familiar. The way he looked at her lingered longer than necessary, and when he spoke, there was an unspoken understanding behind his words, a knowing glance that held more weight than it should have. Lila found herself both flattered and unnerved. She had never been the type to attract attention, especially from someone of his stature. But with each passing day, it became harder to distinguish the boundaries between admiration and something far more complicated. She felt herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain, though she tried to push these feelings aside. The very idea of pursuing something beyond a professional relationship with Colonel James was forbidden, and she knew that crossing that line could come at a high price. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he made her feel both safe and exhilarated. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of drills, James asked her to meet him in his office to discuss her progress. It wasn't unusual for him to take a personal interest in her development, but this time, the invitation felt different. When she arrived, the door was slightly ajar, and James's office was dimly lit, the shadows cast by the setting sun creating a quiet intimacy in the room. He motioned for her to sit, and as she did, their eyes met for a fraction of a second longer than expected. Lila couldn't help but feel a flutter in her chest, a sensation she quickly attributed to nerves. They spoke about her training, about the obstacles she had overcome, and the areas where she still needed improvement. But as the conversation progressed, it shifted. James's words, though still professional, carried a different tone, a softness that Lila hadn't noticed before. He praised her strength, her resilience, and her ability to adapt. But there was an underlying implication that went beyond the context of military skills. When the conversation came to a close, he stood up, offering his hand as a gesture of finality. But instead of the firm handshake Lila had come to expect from him, James's fingers lingered on hers for a moment longer than necessary. a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her body. She pulled her hand away quickly, embarrassed by the sudden rush of warmth that flooded her cheeks. She didn't say anything, hoping he hadn't noticed, but she could feel the shift in the air. Something had changed, and it left her both shaken and uncertain. As she left his office, her mind was racing. The boundary she had so carefully constructed between them now felt fragile, as if it could crumble with a single word, a single touch. Lila knew that she was dangerously close to crossing a line she couldn't undo, but at the same time, she was drawn to him in a way that felt impossible to resist. The colonel had become more than just a mentor. He was now someone who consumed her thoughts, someone whose presence she sought out even when she knew it was wrong. The pull between them was undeniable, and despite the fear that gnawed at her, Lila found herself wondering what might happen if she allowed it to continue, if she gave in to the attraction that simmered beneath the surface. Would it lead to something real, or would it destroy everything she had worked for? She didn't know, but she couldn't stop thinking about it, and as the days went by, the tension between them only grew stronger, setting the stage for what was to come. A dangerous, uncontrollable force that neither of them could resist. The secret between Colonel James and Private Lila Green began to unravel in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. What once felt like an undeniable connection now carried a weight that neither of them could escape. Lila tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than a fleeting attraction, something that would pass with time. But the more she distanced herself, the more James seemed to draw her back in. She began to avoid him in small, cautious ways, choosing different training sessions, walking a little faster to avoid running into him alone in hallways. But it didn't work. James had a way of finding her, of inserting himself into her life even when she tried to keep her distance. His presence was constant, and his attention felt suffocating. Lila began to feel trapped by her own emotions. She was conflicted, torn between her growing feelings for the colonel and the looming consequences of letting things go any further. The whispers of a forbidden relationship seemed to grow louder in her mind, but she tried to shut them out. The last thing she wanted was to be seen as just another soldier, caught up in the charms of a powerful officer. She had always prided herself on her strength and independence, but now, with James's growing interest, she felt more vulnerable than ever before. Despite her attempts to keep her distance, their interactions grew more intimate. James would pull her aside during group exercises to offer private feedback, their conversations lingering in the air between them. The way he spoke to her, with a soft intensity, felt different from the way he addressed anyone else. Lila was no longer just another soldier in his unit. She had become someone he confided in, someone he trusted with his thoughts and insecurities. And though she appreciated the respect, it only made her feel more isolated, caught in a web that she couldn't escape. The worst part was the confusion she felt. James seemed to understand her in ways no one else ever had. He knew her strengths and weaknesses, her dreams and fears, and he made her feel seen in a way that was both comforting and terrifying. She had never felt this way before, simultaneously, uplifted and weighed down by the attention of someone she had admired from the start. But the more they talked, the more she realized that his interest wasn't just about mentoring. It was something deeper, something darker. Lila began to feel uneasy with the growing intensity of their exchanges. What started as subtle gestures, long, lingering looks, or quiet conversations, had escalated. He began to call her into his office more frequently, under the guise of discussing her performance, but the meetings felt increasingly personal. The topics they discussed veered away from her training and into more intimate territory, stories of his past, his life outside the army, his personal struggles. He shared pieces of himself that he had never revealed to anyone, and each time, Lila found herself drawn in deeper. There were moments when she felt like she was on the brink of something new, something exciting, but she also felt a growing sense of dread, as if crossing the line would change everything. The tension between them began to feel like a living thing, always present, always waiting to burst. Lila tried to ignore the feeling, telling herself that she could handle it, that she could compartmentalize the emotions she was experiencing. But every time she saw James, every time they exchanged a glance or spoke in hushed tones, it became harder to ignore the pull between them. She knew she couldn't keep going like this. trapped between the overwhelming force of her attraction and the fear of what would happen if anyone found out. Despite her best efforts to keep her distance, she found herself seeking out his company in moments when she felt vulnerable or unsure. His presence gave her comfort, but it also made her feel conflicted. She was drawn to him, but she was equally afraid of what it would cost her if their connection came to light. The closer she got to him, the more she realized how dangerous this situation had become. It wasn't just about the potential consequences anymore. It was about the hold he had over her, the way he had crept into her thoughts and feelings without her even realizing it. Lila began to wonder if she was losing herself in this tangled mess of emotions, unsure of where her choices ended and his influence began. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she was walking a fine line, and every step she took brought her closer to a point of no return. The tension between Colonel James and Private Lila Green reached a boiling point one evening, when the unspoken feelings between them could no longer be ignored. The air seemed to crackle with electricity as their interactions grew more charged. What had once been subtle, fleeting moments now felt like dangerous sparks, threatening to ignite something neither of them could control. Lila found herself walking a tightrope, unsure of whether she was falling for him or simply caught in the whirlwind of his attention. And yet, she couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at her. It started on a quiet evening, after a particularly exhausting day of training. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the base, and the stillness in the air made everything feel heavier than usual. Lila had stayed late to finish some extra work in the training hall, trying to avoid the distractions that came with being around her fellow soldiers. But as if drawn by some invisible force, she found herself heading toward the office where Colonel James had asked her to meet him earlier that day. She wasn't sure what she expected when she arrived, but the moment she stepped inside, she could feel the shift in the air. James was sitting behind his desk, his gaze sharp as ever, but there was something different about him tonight. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, yet his eyes were focused on her in a way that made her heart race. She tried to stay calm, to remind herself that this was still a professional meeting, but the tension in the room was palpable. Every movement he made, every word he spoke, felt laden with meaning. She had never been in such close quarters with him for this long, and the atmosphere was suffocating. They began by discussing the progress of her training, just as they always did, but there was a new level of familiarity in their exchange. Their conversation drifted from her performance to more personal topics, her goals, her aspirations, and her thoughts on life outside the army. It was almost as if they were trying to outdo each other, sharing intimate details in a way that felt like a test, a challenge. Every word that passed between them felt like a step closer to something inevitable, something both exciting and terrifying. At some point, the conversation fell into silence. The words between them had dried up, leaving only the heavy weight of their proximity. Lila could feel his eyes on her, studying her every move. She shifted uncomfortably, the heat in her chest rising. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to walk away before things got worse. But at that moment, something inside her wanted to stay, to see where this would lead. And before she could stop herself, she found herself speaking. "I don't know what this is anymore," she said softly, more to herself than to him. James didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stood, slowly, deliberately. Lila's heart skipped a beat as he moved toward her, his presence overwhelming. He was standing so close now that she could feel the warmth radiating off of him, a tension crackling in the space between them. She took a small step back, but he mirrored her movement, closing the distance with ease. "I know what it is," he said, his voice low and steady. There was something in his tone that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact, as if he already knew everything she was trying to deny. Lila's mind raced, torn between fear and desire. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to break free from this dangerous pull, but her body betrayed her, standing rooted in place, caught in the gravity of his presence. She felt trapped, cornered by the emotion she had tried so hard to suppress. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The weight of the situation, the danger of what they were about to cross, hung in the air like a looming storm. And just as she thought she might say something to stop it, something to push him away, he reached out and touched her arm. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a shock through her body. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to pull away, to stop everything before it spiraled out of control. But the truth was, she was too far gone. The line between mentor and something more had already been crossed, and there was no going back. She felt herself leaning into the touch, even as her mind screamed at her to stop. Her pulse quickened, and the room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on them both. She couldn't tell where her own desires ended, and his control began. She was lost in the confusion of it all, unsure of whether to resist or to give in completely, and in that moment, as the air between them grew thicker, she realized that the dangerous dance they had been engaging in had led them to the point of no return. The days that followed that moment in Colonel James's office were a blur of confusion and internal conflict for Lila. The tension that had built up between them couldn't be ignored any longer. She was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, a constant battle between desire and self-preservation. After the brief touch of his hand, she found herself thinking about him constantly. His eyes, his voice, the way his presence made her heart race. Every time she saw him, every time they crossed paths in the hallways, she felt the undeniable pull drawing her closer to him, even as a voice in her head warned her to stay away. But as the days went by, that same voice grew quieter. She told herself she was just confused, that it was all part of the strain of military life. The pressure to succeed, the exhaustion of training, the isolation, everything combined to create an emotional vulnerability that made her more susceptible to his attention. She told herself that she could keep things professional, that she could regain control of the situation. But the more she tried to distance herself, the more she realized how impossible it had become. One evening, as the sun began to dip below, the horizon casting long shadows across the base, Lila found herself in the courtyard alone with her thoughts. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. It wasn't just the Colonel's attention that weighed on her. It was the pressure of keeping this secret, of living in a world where every interaction with him felt like it could be the one that exposed everything. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Colonel James standing a few paces away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching her, as if waiting for something, waiting for her to make the next move. The quiet between them was thick, filled with unspoken words. Lila wanted to say something, to break the silence, but words failed her. She couldn't deny the attraction she still felt for him, but she also knew how dangerous this was. He was her superior, and anything more than what they already shared would be a violation of both military protocol and their professional relationship. She knew that getting involved with him, even emotionally, could ruin everything she had worked for. Her career, her reputation, everything would be on the line. But before she could speak, James took a step closer. "Lila," he said, his voice low and steady, "we can't keep pretending this isn't happening. You feel it too." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, to deny that anything was going on, but the truth was undeniable. She had felt it, every time he looked at her, every time their conversations lingered longer than they should. She had felt the weight of their connection, the way it grew stronger with each passing day. "I don't know what to do," she admitted quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He studied her for a moment, as if contemplating his next words carefully. Then, he stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming her senses. "Neither do I," he confessed. "But this is bigger than both of us. We can't ignore it any longer." Lila's heart pounded in her chest and she instinctively took a small step back, feeling her pulse quicken. She wanted to run, to escape this moment, but something kept her rooted in place. There was no denying the pull she felt toward him, but at the same time, she was terrified of what would happen if they crossed that line. Before she could gather her thoughts, he reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was soft, almost tender, but it sent a wave of heat rushing through her. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do, torn between the desire to pull away and the magnetic force that made her want to lean into his touch. The silence stretched between them, each second heavier than the last. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the pressure mounting with every passing moment. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move would send her tumbling into a world of consequences she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But the choice, it seemed, had already been made for her. The pull between them was undeniable, and as much as she tried to fight it, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. They were caught in something that neither of them fully understood, something that was beginning to consume them both. And, as Lila stood there, on the edge of everything she had worked for, she realized that there was no turning back. The days following that moment in the courtyard felt like a blur, each one more suffocating than the last. Lila tried to convince herself that the growing tension between her and Colonel James could be contained, that it could be ignored. But every glance, every touch, seemed to tear down the walls she had carefully built around her emotions. But even as the fear grew, she couldn't bring herself to push him away. There was a part of her that craved him in a way that went beyond reason. The control he had over her, the way he knew exactly how to manipulate her emotions, had ensnared her completely. But as the days wore on, things began to change. The subtle signs were there at first. Small moments when she noticed his gaze lingering on her for too long, a shift in his demeanor when they were alone. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something felt off. The connection they had shared now felt tainted, strained by the undercurrent of possessiveness that had begun to seep into their relationship. What had once felt like love, passion, desire, had morphed into something darker. He no longer just wanted her, he needed her, and in ways that terrified her, he began to demand more. Lila tried to pull away, to remind herself of the reasons why this was wrong, but James's hold on her was too strong. He began to show up at her barracks unannounced, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The subtle moments they had shared, the stolen touches and secret conversations, turned into something more suffocating. He would appear in the hallways, blocking her path with that unnerving gaze, and she felt trapped, unable to escape. The breaking point came one night when she received a call in the middle of the night. It was from Colonel James. His voice on the other end was cold, distant, in stark contrast to the warmth and passion they had once shared. "Meet me," he said simply, and the command in his voice left no room for argument. There was something in his tone that sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the same man she had once admired. It was someone else, someone she couldn't recognize. When she arrived at the meeting spot, her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what was about to happen, but something inside her knew that this was the point of no return. As she approached him, the darkness of the night seemed to swallow them whole. He was standing there, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid, like a man on the edge of losing control. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he began, his voice low and deliberate. But his words, once comforting, now held a menacing edge. "I need you to understand that you belong to me." The coldness in his words struck her like a slap. He had always been controlling in subtle ways, but now the truth of it was undeniable. He was no longer the man she had once admired, the mentor she had trusted. He was someone dangerous, and the realization hit her like a wave. Lila felt her breath catch in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him that she couldn't continue like this, that she was suffocating under the weight of his obsession. But the words wouldn't come. She was paralyzed by fear, trapped in a situation she had no idea how to escape. He took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming. And then, in an instant, everything changed. There was no warning, no final exchange of words. He pulled a gun from his jacket, his eyes narrowing in something that wasn't love or desire. It was something darker, something that chilled her to the bone. Before she could react, before she could process what was happening, a shot rang out. The world seemed to slow down as the sound echoed in her ears. Lila felt the searing pain in her side as the bullet found its mark. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around her. As her vision blurred and her breathing became ragged, she realized with a sickening clarity that the colonel, the man she had once trusted, had just ended everything in the most brutal way imaginable. The affair, the obsession, the twisted connection between them had culminated in this. And in that final horrifying moment, she understood the true cost of being caught in the web of power, desire, and control.